Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 of Unit 4. I hope you've been enjoying Unit 4. It's a fascinating period in history, as have the other three units been. In particular, though, this particular unit focused a lot on the Cold War and kind of the evolution of the Cold War during an important pivotal period, and of course the culmination of the Cold War with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, marking officially the end of the Cold War. This 45-year ideological struggle between the ideals associated with classical liberalism, which would include written constitutions, having a Bill of Rights, a free market environment in regard to the economy, and of course the protection of basic inalienable rights best articulated and defined in the Declaration of Independence. That would be, of course, classical liberalism, and then the ideals that were associated with communism as they manifested themselves in the Soviet Union and in China, which tended to be more totalitarian regimes, de-emphasis on individual rights, and more of a command economy. Where the government would dictate what was produced and how much would be produced, etc. And so this ideological conflict unfolded. In the 1980s, you see this sort of climactic playing out of this ideological struggle as Ronald Reagan comes into the White House. And whether you hate him or you love him, you got to admit that he did take a definitive stand in regard to the Cold War in the Soviet Union, and he definitely moved away from that spirit of détente that had so defined much of the 1970s. Ronald Reagan would use tough rhetoric against the Soviets, including calling them an evil empire, and he also pushed for a strong military buildup during the 1980s. This led some to fear that an accidental nuclear war would occur, and of course we saw that fear play out in the Butter Battle book with Dr. Seuss. But there were other ways in which it played out, including the production and the release of a made-for-TV movie called The Day After, which chronicled a nuclear holocaust and then the individuals that were trying to survive in a post-nuclear Holocaust world and dealing with all the things they had to deal with. It was very unnerving. I remember when it came out, and yeah, it scared me. I'll tell you that. I had a few nightmares about that one. But this was, just typical in the Cold War, the fear that at any time there could be some sort of nuclear annihilation. And, it was nerve-wracking at times to see some of the ways that the Cold War played out in the 1980s with a huge military buildup and then also some very strong rhetoric. However, in the end, the rhetoric, the military buildup, it won out, you could argue, because the Soviets could not match what the U.S. was investing in military expenditures. Also, with the Soviet Union being pulled into Afghanistan, a feudal struggle that they were involved in and that cost the country a large amount of money, they, in essence, found themselves in a position where they needed to change their course. And with Gorbachev, he was able to bring in some political freedoms and economic freedoms that eventually unleashed the forces that would bring about the end of the Cold War. So having said that, that sets us up, really, for the 1990s. And what I wanted to just share with you today were some thoughts about an interesting theory that emerged after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. An individual by the name of Francis Fukuyama published a book in which he argued that in looking at the end of the Cold War, what we were witnessing was the end of history. And what he meant by that was that he was turning to the philosophy of Hegel, the German 19th century historical philosopher Hegel, who argued that history is defined by ideological struggle. And so at any given time, when you look at the past, you could understand the past best by looking at the major ideological forces that were at work against one another. And Francis Fukuyama argued that the ideological struggles that defined basically the 19th century and the 20th century revolved around classical liberalism coming up against different ideologies and winning each time. So what he argued was, in essence, that over the course of the 19th century, to understand 19th century history, you would want to see that there was a grand struggle between the forces of classical liberalism and monarchy, and that World War I marked, in essence, the end of monarchy. Now, of course, there are still monarchies in the world, but as far as being an ideological force, they're non-existent as far as being some sort of alternative plan to turn to as opposed to classical liberalism. World War I witnessed the breakup of Germany, it witnessed the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it witnessed the fall of Russia under imperial rule, and a monarch. Of course, the monarchy there was executed, and so even the Ottoman Empire was broken up. So these powerful monarchies that had so defined the 19th century, they were gone. Classical liberalism lived on. And even in England, where you still see a monarch, the 19th century witnessed increasingly the monarch being weakened and weakened and even more weakened as the forces of democracy, in essence, and republican government took root and grew. Well, after World War I, the ideological force that sprung up to challenge classical liberalism was fascism. And of course, as you know from your readings, World War II would mark the end of fascism as an ideological threat to classical liberalism. So during the period of roughly the 20s and 30s up through the mid-40s, the ideological struggle that defined and shaped history during that period was the struggle between classical liberalism and fascism. Well, then following World War II, a new ideological force really emerged that truly challenged classical liberalism, and of course that was communism. And so thus the Cold War was defined by this ideological struggle, this what Hegel would refer to as a dialectic between a thesis and an antithesis. And you see classical liberalism against communism. And with the fall of communism in 1991, now again, there's still communist states in the world. China is a large one. But as far as an actual viable challenge to classical liberalism in regard to ideology, that force has been severely weakened. The Cold War's end marked the end of that dialectic. And so Francis Fukuyama basically argued that eventually China would be morphing more into more of a classical liberal state in regard to its embracing more and more free market thoughts. And thus, with no definitive ideological struggle facing classical liberalism, there was in essence the end of history. And so this really guided a lot of U.S. thought during the 1990s. And historians struggled, political theorists struggled to try to define what would be the next struggle that would emerge. Were we truly at the end of history? Well, of course, September 11th, 2001 answered that question. And what we now see is an ideological struggle that still involves classical liberalism, but in essence what we're seeing are reactionary, ultra-conservative forces around the globe that are struggling and challenging globalization. That in essence the fuel behind globalization is commercialism, a free market mentality, a classical liberal mentality. And this globalization, which is by no means something that is entirely embracing diversity, it is highly defined by U.S. culture, that those forces that stand up against that globalization in the form of many times terrorism, that struggle is what's defining history today. And so, in essence, we haven't reached the end of history, even though you're reaching the end of the course, and I hope your studies will continue to take you in many interesting directions as you study history. Have a good night or a good day whenever you're watching this, and good luck on the final exam. Take care.